You've conquered your demons, dismantled your defenses, and emerged victorious from the battlefield of your own psyche. Yet here you stand, not triumphant, but strangely hollow. The fire that once drove you has been extinguished, and in its place lies an unsettling calm. You should feel powerful, liberated, alive. Instead, you feel nothing at all. This, my friend, is not defeat. This is the most dangerous moment in any ruler's journey, the moment when old strategies no longer serve, but new ones have yet to reveal themselves. What you're experiencing isn't failure, it's the calculated silence of a mind that has learned to distinguish between authentic power and mere performance. Let me share with you a truth that even the great strategists rarely speak of openly. When you truly master yourself, when you've excavated every hidden weakness and integrated every shadow, you don't simply become stronger. You become fundamentally different. Your entire system of motivation, everything that once compelled you to act, doesn't just shift, it dies. And that death, uncomfortable as it may be, is the most strategic thing that could happen to you. Consider this carefully. For years, perhaps decades, you were driven by forces you didn't even recognize. The desperate need for approval masquerading as ambition. The terror of abandonment disguised as productivity. The compulsion to prove your worth wearing the mask of success. These weren't conscious choices. They were survival mechanisms, operating in the shadows of your awareness, pulling your strings like a master puppeteer. But here's where it gets interesting. When you do the deep work, when you truly face your shadow and integrate those rejected parts of yourself, you don't just heal those wounds. You expose the entire machinery. Suddenly, you can see how much of your life was driven by fear pretending to be courage, how much of your motivation was actually just sophisticated avoidance dressed up as pursuit. When that machinery stops working, when those unconscious drivers are no longer driving you, you don't just lose motivation. You lose the only reasons you've ever had to be motivated. This is what the ancient alchemists called the necessary dissolution before rebirth. But nobody prepares you for how strategically brilliant this emptiness actually is. Let me tell you about Elena, not her real name, but her story is completely authentic. Elena was a master of corporate warfare, climbing the executive ladder with ruthless efficiency. She understood power, wielded influence, and commanded respect. But beneath that polished exterior, she was running on pure survival instinct, driven by childhood wounds she'd never acknowledged. After a particularly brutal corporate betrayal revealed patterns she'd been carrying for decades, Elena made a strategic decision. She would do the inner work, not out of weakness, but out of recognition that her current operating system had vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She spent 2 years in intensive self-examination, facing every fear, healing every wound, integrating every shadow. By the end of those 2 years, she was genuinely transformed. The anxiety that had fueled her relentless drive was gone. The need to dominate every room had dissolved. The fear of being seen as weak had transformed into genuine confidence. But when she tried to return to her corporate battlefield, something had fundamentally changed. The power games that once energized her felt hollow. The strategic maneuvering that used to thrill her seemed pointless. The victories she'd been pursuing for years suddenly appeared as elaborate distractions from something she couldn't yet name. "I used to wake up every morning ready for war," she told me. "Even if it was destructive, even if it was fear-based, it was fuel. Now I wake up and feel nothing. Like I'm waiting for orders from a commander who's gone silent." This is the moment when most people panic. They assume something has gone wrong, that they've somehow broken themselves in the process of healing. But what Elena was experiencing wasn't malfunction. It was the most sophisticated recalibration possible. Her psyche was refusing to let her re-engage with motivations that were never truly hers to begin with. Think about it strategically. Every motivation you've ever had that was based on fear, on social expectations, on proving your worth, on avoiding pain, all of it served a purpose when you were operating from a wounded position. But once you've healed those wounds, once you've integrated those shadows, continuing to operate from those same motivations would be like a master strategist continuing to use tactics designed for a much weaker position. Your soul, in its infinite wisdom, is protecting you from going backward. It's refusing to let you re-engage with strategies that were born from scarcity, fear, and unconscious compulsion. But it hasn't yet revealed what will motivate you moving forward, because that new motivation must emerge from a completely different foundation, one of wholeness rather than woundedness, abundance rather than scarcity, authentic power rather than compensatory performance. This isn't laziness. This isn't stagnation. This is your psyche executing the most sophisticated strategic maneuver possible, creating space for something genuinely powerful to emerge. In traditional warfare, the most dangerous generals are those who know when not to act, who understand that sometimes the most strategic move is to wait, to observe, to let the battlefield reveal its true nature before committing to any course of action. Your inner battlefield has changed completely. The enemies you once fought, shame, fear, inadequacy, have been defeated. The territories you once needed to defend, your ego, your image, your sense of worth, have been secured. But the war isn't over. It's evolved. And the strategies that won the last battle are not the strategies that will win the next one. Here's what changes everything. The silence you're experiencing isn't emptiness, it's potential. It's your psyche creating the conditions for you to hear what it's been trying to tell you all along, but which was previously drowned out by the noise of unconscious compulsion. Let me share another story, this one about Marcus, a brilliant entrepreneur who built multiple successful companies through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. But Marcus was driven by a deep fear of poverty, a terror of being seen as unsuccessful, a compulsion to prove that he was worthy of respect. These fears made him incredibly effective and incredibly exhausted. After a health scare forced him to confront the unsustainability of his approach, Marcus embarked on his own journey of inner work. He faced his fears, healed his wounds, integrated his shadows. The transformation was profound, but when he tried to return to his entrepreneurial activities, he felt like he was wearing armor that no longer fit. "I used to be so driven," he told me. "I'd work 18-hour days and love it. I had 5-year plans, 10-year goals. I knew exactly what I wanted and exactly how to get it. Now I look at those same goals and feel nothing. It's like they belong to someone else." Marcus thought he was losing his edge. He worried that healing had made him soft, that integration had cost him his competitive advantage. But what he was experiencing wasn't weakness. It was the natural result of profound strategic evolution. His old motivations, proving his worth through achievement, avoiding the shame of failure, earning respect through success, were no longer available to him because shadow work had resolved those underlying fears. But his new motivations, the ones that would come from his authentic power rather than his wounded ego, hadn't emerged yet. He was in the space between strategies, the liminal realm where old tactics have been abandoned, but new ones haven't yet been revealed. This is the moment that separates true masters from mere practitioners. Most people, when they reach this point, panic. They try to force their old motivations to return. They push through the void, ignore the silence, and go back to their old way of operating. But this is a strategic error of the highest magnitude because it means building a new life on the same old foundations. The truly wise understand that this void is not a problem to be solved. It's intelligence to be trusted. Your psyche is creating the conditions for you to discover what real motivation feels like. Motivation that comes from truth rather than compulsion. from abundance rather than scarcity, from authentic power rather than compensatory performance. When new motivation emerges from this place, it feels completely different. It's not anxious or urgent. It's not driven by what you lack or what you're trying to prove. It's quiet, steady, undeniable. It's like the difference between artificial stimulation and natural energy. Both will get you moving, but one nourishes while the other depletes. This deeper motivation doesn't scream for attention. It whispers invitations. It doesn't create drama or crisis to get you to act. It creates resonance, alignment, a sense of rightness that needs no external validation. When you learn to recognize this voice, when you learn to trust this guidance, motivation stops being about conquering resistance and starts being about following resonance. Marcus discovered this when he stopped trying to force his old drive to return and started paying attention to what was actually calling to him. During his period of apparent unmotivation, he found himself drawn to mentoring young entrepreneurs, not because it was good for his image or his network, but because something in him came alive when he shared what he'd learned. This wasn't driven by ego or strategy in the old sense. It wasn't motivated by proving his expertise or building his reputation. It was motivated by something else entirely, by the simple recognition that he had something valuable to offer, and that offering it felt more aligned with who he was becoming than anything he'd done in years. That curiosity led to conversations. Those conversations led to opportunities. Those opportunities led to a new kind of business, one that felt less like imposing his will on the market and more like responding to what the market actually needed, one that honored both his expertise and his evolution, his strategic brilliance and his newfound wisdom. But here's the crucial insight. None of this would have happened if he had tried to force his old motivation to return. If he had pushed through the void and gone back to his old way of operating, he would have missed the whisper entirely. He would have continued building companies that looked impressive but felt empty, achieving success that satisfied his ego but starved his soul. The authentic self doesn't roar. It hums. It doesn't demand attention. It offers invitations. It doesn't create urgency. It creates resonance. When you learn to hear that hum, when you learn to trust that gentle guidance, you discover that real power doesn't come from forcing outcomes, but from aligning with what wants to emerge. This is what the great strategists understood, but rarely spoke about directly. True mastery isn't about controlling every variable. It's about positioning yourself so skillfully that the right opportunities naturally gravitate toward you. It's about becoming so aligned with your authentic nature that the universe itself becomes your ally rather than your adversary. When you're motivated by this deeper intelligence, work becomes devotion rather than obligation. Relationships become conscious choice rather than unconscious need. Creativity becomes expression rather than performance. Rest becomes strategic renewal rather than guilty laziness. Boundaries become intelligent self-preservation rather than selfish withdrawal. And here's the paradox that would shock your old self. This gentler approach often accomplishes more than the frantic energy that came before, because it's sustainable, because it's aligned with who you actually are rather than who you think you should be, because it's coming from fullness rather than emptiness, from wisdom rather than compulsion. There's a practice I want to offer you here, a way to discern between ego motivation and authentic motivation in your own life. Take out a piece of paper and write down 3 things you feel you should be motivated about right now. Things you think you ought to want, ought to pursue, ought to care about. Then ask yourself, where does this should come from? Whose voice is that really? Who would be disappointed if I didn't care about this? What am I afraid will happen if I let this go? What am I trying to prove by wanting this? Then write down 3 things you find yourself drawn to, even if they don't make logical sense. Things that spark curiosity or wonder or peace. things that make you feel more alive, more present, more like yourself. Ask yourself, what would it feel like to follow this pull without needing to justify it? What would it feel like to trust this attraction without needing to understand it completely? The difference between those two lists might reveal the difference between motivation that comes from fear and motivation that comes from truth, between drive that exhausts you and draw that nourishes you, between the voice of your wounded ego and the whisper of your authentic power. Elena, the corporate executive I mentioned earlier, discovered through this process that her fear-based motivation in the business world had been covering up a deep calling to work in conflict resolution, not because she thought she should, not because it would look good to others, but because something in her came alive when she helped people find common ground, something that had been buried under years of competitive warfare. It took her 18 months to make the transition from corporate executive to mediation specialist, 18 months of following curiosity rather than clarity, of trusting the process rather than controlling the outcome, of taking strategic steps toward what felt true rather than dramatic leaps toward what looked impressive. Her former colleagues thought she was having a midlife crisis. Her family worried about the pay cut. Her logical mind had 1,000 objections, but her soul was singing again for the first time in decades, and she understood that this wasn't retreat. It was the most sophisticated strategic advance she'd ever made. So here's what I want you to understand with absolute clarity. You didn't lose your motivation. You outgrew the reasons that once compelled you. This isn't a consolation prize. This isn't settling for less. This is graduating to a level of strategic thinking that most people never reach, where your actions are guided by wisdom rather than compulsion, by authentic power rather than compensatory performance. The silence you've been afraid of. That's where your true strategic intelligence has been waiting to speak. The emptiness you've been trying to fill. That space being created for something more real, more sustainable, more genuinely powerful than anything you've experienced before. The great strategists understood this. On the other side of apparent defeat often lies the most profound victory. Not the victory you were expecting, not the triumph you were planning, but something real, something that doesn't need to be defended because it's rooted in truth rather than image, in authentic power rather than borrowed authority. The motivation that emerges from this place doesn't burn you out because it's not coming from deficit. It doesn't leave you empty because it's not taking more than it gives. It doesn't disappear when circumstances change because it's rooted in who you are, not what you want. If you're in the void right now, if you're feeling unmotivated and wondering what's wrong with you, I want you to consider this possibility. Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe something is very, very right. Maybe your psyche is finally sophisticated enough to stop performing. Maybe your strategic intelligence is finally integrated enough to tell the difference between authentic desire and inherited obligation. Maybe you're finally powerful enough to wait for real inspiration instead of running on manufactured urgency. Listen to the silence, not with your ears, but with your strategic mind. What has it been trying to tell you? What has it been protecting you from? What has it been preparing you for? Your old life, the one driven by fear and need, and the endless hunger for external validation. That life served its purpose. You used it to build strength, to develop skills, to learn the rules of the game. But that apprenticeship is over. You did the work to end it. You faced your shadow specifically so you wouldn't have to live that way anymore. This isn't the end of your strategic development. This is the beginning of your mastery. This is where the real game starts. The self you're becoming doesn't need motivation in the old sense. It needs recognition. It needs trust. It needs you to stop trying so hard to become someone else and start paying attention to who you already are. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are exactly where you need to be for the next phase of your strategic evolution to begin. And when it does begin, When that quiet hum of authentic motivation starts to emerge, you'll understand why the silence was so necessary. You'll see why the void had to be emptied before it could be filled with something real. You'll realize that losing your old motivation wasn't a problem to be solved. It was intelligence to be trusted. The intelligence of a psyche that had learned to distinguish between performance and authenticity, between borrowed power and genuine authority, between the strategies of survival and the strategies of mastery. The void isn't the end of your story. It's the strategic pause between the life you've been living and the life you're meant to live. And that life, built on the foundation of authentic power rather than compensatory performance, rooted in truth rather than image, guided by wisdom rather than compulsion, that life is worth every moment of uncertainty you're experiencing now. This is not retreat. This is the most sophisticated advance you've ever made. Trust the process. Trust the silence. Trust the intelligence that brought you this far and knows exactly where you're going next. The game has changed. The rules have evolved. And you, whether you realize it yet or not, are exactly where you need to be to play at a level you never imagined possible.